Welcome to the Clothed in Glory campaign, where we hold gender justice conversations. You can find the rest of the videos in our playlist under Clothed in Glory.
Those of you who are new, my name is Paola Fuentes Gleghorn, and I'm the Immigration and Women and Girls Campaign Manager for Sojourners. And I have the privilege of connecting with all of you through this Clothed in Glory campaign. So I wanted to start with a little bit of the campaign as we started this back in March, and we'll review kind of what we've learned and what actions we can take and have a time to share with each other and reflect. And we know that our clothes connect us to people, to our families, to our friends, to movements, to creation itself. And fashion and clothing are common threads that can also connect our advocacy for a world where women and all people are given equal respect, opportunity, and protection. Also for a sustainable world that pursues climate justice. And also for a world where the rights of all workers are protected. And we know that many workers who work in the garment industry are women. And so all of these things are tied together, and our clothes can be that connecting thread to all of these. And the decisions we make around clothing and fashion and the choices we make to seek justice are spiritual disciplines that are deeply intertwined. And this is why when we talk about Clothed in Glory, we're talking about faith and fashion, because we know that those are spiritual disciplines. But yet we know that Bible verses about clothing and fashion have been used by Christians without consideration many times to their historical context. And they've been used to justify abuse and control over how we dress and how we adorn our bodies. Women's bodies have been policed and their clothing choices restricted. What women wear has been used to demonize or blame them for being victims of abuse. But we know that if fashion can be used to oppress people, it can also liberate us. And that's why we're reclaiming the gloriousness of our bodies and how we adorn them in our journey to seek justice. The same Bible verses that have been used to justify violence and control can liberate us, can really reaffirm that gloriousness of our bodies that we know are made in the image of God, and support our justice practices that we want to seek. So throughout the Clothed in Glory campaign, we started back in March, we've been learning how fashion and faith strengthen social justice movements. We've also been taking actions to engage in fashion and advocacy as a way to live out our faith. And I wanted to take this call for us to reflect on what we've learned, what actions we have taken, or what actions we plan to take in the future. Many times we can get caught up in absorbing all the information and taking actions, and we don't take enough time to step back and really reflect and take some time to let that learning sink in. Grace Lee Boggs has a quote that says, "There are times when expanding our imagination is what is required. The radical movement has overemphasized the role of activism and underestimated the role of reflection." And so that's what I wanted to take this call to do, to take that time to reflect both on our own, and then sharing with one another, and getting inspiration and stories of how we've been engaging with what we've been learning and the actions we've taken. So during today's conversation, first, I want to go over a very brief overview of the last months from March till now. We'll be talking about what we've learned. What are some things that stick out to you? Obviously, in the overview, I won't touch on everything that our wonderful speakers have spoken on. So we can, if you recall something, like what was it about that piece of information that made it stick in your mind? And then what actions we have taken, and perhaps you'll hear somebody who took an action and be inspired to do the same. And if you've not taken action, that's okay too. We can think and talk about what actions we can plan to take in the future and how we can make sure that we do that, and what supports we need to do those actions. So that's an overview of the call today. And so we started in March. We did this wonderful exercise around pockets. And we learned that if you're wearing clothes traditionally marketed to men, your pockets will likely fit your entire hand, a wallet, a phone. So many things can fit in your pocket. But if you're wearing clothes traditionally marketed to women, your clothes will likely not have pockets, or if they do, they're very small. You can barely fit your pinky. Maybe a coin can fit in there. And so we talked about why this was the case. And we talked about how in women's clothing in Europe and the US, they used to have these enormous tied-on pockets hidden under the skirt. So women's clothing didn't always have this problem of lack of pockets. But then in the late 1700s, garment makers added sewn-in pockets to the clothing of people who could own property and who needed to carry money or documents or even weapons. So these were only sewed into the clothes of men. And then in the late 1800s, women's clothing became more form-fitting, and tied-on pockets were ditched for a tiny pouch carried by your hand. So later, when women began to advocate for political equality, financial equality, and voting rights, they started teaching each other how to sew pockets into their clothes. This would allow them to navigate these public spaces unaccompanied and carry important documents. And so, for example, what became known as the suffragette suit, popular in 1910, had at least 6 pockets. Then during World War I and World War II, women joined the workforce and gained more pockets. But when men came back to their jobs after the war, women lost their jobs and their pockets, and the popularity of handbags rose. And today's designers don't always include pockets in women's clothing because they're assuming that women don't need to carry a lot, or that they will have free hands to carry a purse. And we see this, the same ideas of the same sexist ideas of the past that originally removed pockets from women's clothing. And so we talked about how our clothing is so much more than just fashion choices that we make, but there's a history there. They can be used both to oppress and to kind of reinforce these ideas, sexist ideas around men or women. But as you see in the history of pockets, they can also be used to liberate people and used creatively to aid in movement. And the action that we were encouraged to take for March was around the Equal Rights Amendment. And we know that this is something that women started fighting for a long time ago, along with these ideas of political, financial, voting rights for women. We were also fighting to be included in the Constitution. And the Equal Rights Amendment is a very short amendment that says people cannot be discriminated on the basis of sex. Unfortunately, hundreds of years later, we are still not included in the Constitution. And so this is an action alert that we can take, asking our members of Congress to take action to make sure that the Equal Rights Amendment is added to the U.S. Constitution. This past March marked 50 years since Congress sent the Equal Rights Amendment to be ratified. And in January 27 of this year, the ERA made all constitutional requirements to be added to the Constitution after it was ratified by 38 states, passed with the majority in Congress, and following the 2-year period from the last of those 38 states to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. But there are some procedural questions that opponents claim and use as an excuse for it not to be added. And so that's why one of the things we can ask is to ask our members of Congress to remove that deadline to add the ERA to the Constitution. So that's what we talked about in March to start off the campaign. Then April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And so we talked about how many times when people are victims and survivors of sexual assault, one of the questions, that very inappropriate questions that people ask is, but what was she wearing? Why wasn't she more careful about what she was wearing? And so we talked about how fashion and clothing have been used to victim blame and to silence survivors of sexual assault and protect people and systems that perpetuate sexual assault. We've heard from a sexual assault survivor from one of our partner organizations, Freely and Hope, and she talked about her experience, but also how she used fashion and clothing to really reclaim the gloriousness of her body, reclaim her agency in that healing process. And so we talked about how we as Christians should be leaders in changing the narrative to end victim blaming and to create safe spaces in our churches and our places of worship where people can come and find healing and justice after sexual assault. So that was a conversation we had in April. We had this great article also written by somebody from Freely and Hope that talked about how churches can help survivors of domestic violence. A lot of the same things apply to survivors of sexual violence. So we talked about preaching, about supporting healthy relationships and training congregation and leaders around how to spot signs of domestic and sexual violence, but also what do healthy relationships look like? Connecting with local leaders, letting survivors speak, offering time and money for survivors of sexual assault, and then being sure to name the sin and to make a very clear stance that your place of worship does not tolerate sexual assault and sexual violence. So that was some of the things that we talked about during April Sexual Assault Awareness Month and how it related to fashion and clothing. And again, you can see that interaction of clothing can be used to oppress and to silence, but it can also be used to liberate, to reclaim our gloriousness, our agency as we heal from some of these very negative experiences. Then we went to May, which was May Day, Workers' Day, International Workers' Day. And this is when we got to a lot of the meat of the garment workers. And we learned that, unfortunately, even though the United States has a 2.4 trillion clothing and shoe industry that employs millions of people worldwide, we learned that the life of a garment worker, and as I mentioned, many of these are women, is marked by exploitation, very long hours of work with mandatory unpaid overtime, very ridiculous quotas that workers have to meet every day, so working very quickly to meet these quotas, very poor pay, and then enduring a lot of abuse from supervisors. And as we talked about gender justice and women and girls and gender-based violence, we also learned that it's very common in the garment industry. Pregnant workers being fired or denied maternity leave, women facing verbal sexual harassment, pressured into sex, and even murdered for refusing advances. And this is a picture you see here of a woman who was murdered for refusing to have sex with her supervisor. But yet we also learned that many garment industry workers around the world, including some incredible women, and we talked about these 3 women as examples, are doing some incredible work to organize, to stop these abuses, and to really secure a just and safe work environment for garment workers. And so we learned that together, one of the things we can do is hold countries and factories accountable for how they treat industry workers. We know that for many of these garment and industry workers, this work is very necessary to be able to provide for themselves and their families. And so instead of saying, take those factories away, or we're not going to buy from these companies, one of the other things that we can do is to hold those factories, those companies, those clothing labels, countries accountable and say, yes, keep the factories there, keep the clothing brands there, but make sure that people who work in the garment industry are safe, are paid fairly, have fair hours and treatment while they do so. And so some of the advocacy actions that we talked about was this concept of being a conscientious consumer. So knowing how to do research, how to examine this whole production chain of where our clothes come from, how to follow up on those brands to say, if there's a brand that's not treating workers fairly, or that is not holding the factories in the countries where the clothes come from accountable for fair treatment, like how can we pressure those companies to do so? And demanding this information from companies. So it's this about being a little more curious and doing research around where our clothes come from and who's making them and how are people being treated. And so we talked about one of the ways that we can do that is connecting with garment worker advocacy groups. And here are some examples. These are groups that are doing a lot of that research for us, that are putting these campaigns together where we can join them. On social media is a great tool that we can use, but also there's petitions that we can sign. As you can see here, different petitions, donating to these organizations that are doing that advocacy work on the ground. And then paired with being a conscientious consumer is pairing our purchases with actions, right? We know that we can't be perfect, and that's not the point. It's not to make ourselves feel guilty about the clothes that we buy and being like, oh, I can't buy anything because everything is fraught with so many issues. But it's about being aware and then taking actions. And it's about taking these collective actions, right? If all of us, for example, hold Levi's accountable to sign this accord that says they will support safe factory conditions for their workers who make their jeans, if we all sign on to that campaign, expand it, let people know others are messaging Levi's, then we can make sure that Levi's changes their practices. And then when we go buy jeans, we can be assured that, hey, they were made by people who are being treated fairly. And so that's just one example of how we can pair our purchases with our actions that can take a very short amount of time. Sending a tweet if you're in social media or Instagram, or sending them an email, making sure that these labels, these clothing stores are using fair practices to make their clothes that they sell to us. So that was what we talked about in May. And in the follow-up email, I'll be sure to send all of these resources, because our speaker, Kira, for May, created this wonderful 2-page resource guide that has all this information for what actions we can take to support the wonderful work of these garment workers who are working for better treatment in their workspaces. Then June was Pride Month, and there we talked about one of the reasons that we started talking about faith and fashion was that fashion can spark joy and invite self-expression. And so it's a way to engage in advocacy and justice work that is hopeful, empowering, joyful. But we also talked about that fashion can be a source of dread, that oppressive designs seek to make people fit into these dominant expectations around gender, disability, race, and class. And then during Pride Month, we specifically talked about how for many queer and trans people, the very act of getting dressed can be an act of resistance and a challenge to these oppressive systems. But again, we also talked about how if fashion can be used to oppress people, it can also liberate us. And it can be a way that we glorify God, that we reaffirm the glory of our bodies made in the image of God. And so we heard from 2 wonderful speakers, a trans pastor and their partner as well, about both how they've used fashion in that self-expression to reclaim the gloriousness of their body. And we were encouraged to discuss Bible verses and stories that relate to queer theology and LGBTQ rights and inclusion with small groups or others in our faith community, and how many times there are scriptures that have been weaponized against many people, but when we read them and we listen to the perspectives of people with marginalized identities, like our queer and LGBTQ siblings, we can learn so many things and see these scriptures in a new light and learn how we can join the efforts of our LGBTQ siblings in pursuing inclusion and rights. So I'll be sure to include these 2 pastors had 2 great podcasts precisely around these things. And then for our advocacy, we talked about how we've seen so many anti-LGBTQ plus bills at the state level. Not that long ago, there was the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, the criminalization of gender affirming care in Texas, And so it's really important to be aware of what those bills in your state that are being proposed that harm LGBTQ individuals, as well as bills that are being proposed that protect LGBTQ individuals and their rights. So you can connect with others in your state, with organizations in your state that are working to oppose the harmful bills and support the helpful ones, and finding out how we can get involved in those efforts. So that was what we talked about in June. And I know I'm giving you a lot of information, but this is just a very quick overview. And in case you weren't able to be there for one of these months, you're getting a very brief overview of what we've talked about. And then lastly, we talked about in July, wearing our Sunday's best. And this is a tradition within many Black churches where you are showing up to church in your best. And you did this to in social media to bring attention to Black maternal and newborn health. We know that about 700 women die each year in the United States as a result of pregnancy or delivery complications. And we know that even more devastating is that race plays a key role. So we know that the maternal death ratio for Black women is 2.5 times the ratio for white women and 3 times the ratio for Hispanic women. And so the social media challenge was to share about this ongoing maternal health crisis on social media and to ask our Congress people to address this crisis through meaningful legislation like the Omnibus Act. And so we talked about some of these statistics, this chart shows that the United States has the highest maternal mortality ratio of these, what we call industrialized countries like Canada, France, Germany. And so we talked about the Omnibus Act and what it does and how it would help to address this crisis. And so we had a suggested social media post where you could tag your members of Congress, where you could raise awareness about what is happening right now in this crisis, where especially Black women are dying as a result of pregnancy or delivery complications, and asking our members of Congress to address that crisis through meaningful legislation. So I will stop there as far as the review. Hopefully this was review for many of you who've been coming to these calls. I did want to make sure I share these shared agreements again. Make sure you're honoring the stories shared. When you're responding to someone's story, don't question or challenge the validity of their experience, of their learning, of their journey, and then be sure to tell your own story and speak for yourself only. And we want these breakout rooms to be sacred spaces where we're not sharing somebody's story without permission or consent, and we can share resources and information that others have learned with attribution and consent. And then making sure we're valuing and centering the margins, those whose voices are least heard. And then, as we talk about, we're valuing co-learning and co-teaching. So we're all in this journey of learning throughout these 5 months. We've been learning so much, but we also know there's so much wisdom within each of us. And probably many of you could speak even more to all of these topics that we've talked about. So making sure to value that. And especially what I wanted to touch on here was expressing rather than impressing and not performing perfectionism, right? We're not sharing our learnings and our action to be like, wow, I'm such a wonderful person. Look at all I've done. No, it's about being able to help each other in this journey, being able to share our wisdom with others and also learn from others. And so first, if you just want to do very quick intros, sharing your name, what state you're located, if you're connected to a congregation or an organization, and then sharing just like if there's a fact or statistic or a learning from a previous conversation that really stuck out with you, share that and think through like, why was it that it stuck in your mind after all these weeks? What was it about it? These, you don't have to go in order of these reflection questions, but what are 2 important lessons that you've learned? What are 3 things that you learned that you really want to share with others? And what is something else that you want to learn that we touched on, but you're like, I really want to learn more about that. As we talk about these reflection questions, what are some lessons or some learnings that you've had, or something that you've shared with others as you've attended these calls, or as you were hearing the overview? What are some things that really stuck out to you that we've learned around faith and fashion and social justice and gender justice? Or what is something that you really want to learn more about and find more resources on? Well, I want to take the last 10 minutes or so to also talk about what actions we've taken, or if you're new and just hearing, what actions do you want to take this month? And then what kind of support do you need from others to take that action? And where can you find that support around these issues of gender justice, fashion, faith, social justice? Or if you have taken action, would love to hear. It basically goes through, we do observation first, or we look at whatever story or scripture, then we do interpretation, where we ask a lot of why questions and what was the intended meaning and who is being spoken to in the verse. And then we do application of how can we apply what we're learning from this verse. So yes, we've had some from the beginning of the campaign around sexual assault, around workers' rights, around LGBTQ. So thank you. I'm glad that those have been helpful. And then also with that, you can do the Bible study. And then usually every month, there's also some resources around actions you can take. So I've been doing work in advocacy around immigration and climate justice, basically since I graduated college. I am an immigrant myself, lived in Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and just very, very aware of a lot of these issues around injustice and poverty and access to resources. And then came to Sojourners about 3 years ago to do work specifically on immigration and gender justice. And it's actually a really interesting story. We were, I came in and then COVID started, and so we were all remote. As during one of those lulls of the spread, we were able to go to a conference together, and we were just commenting on each other's fashion. I had a coworker who's very fashionable, and then she started sharing about how a lot of her clothes, she actually goes to her grandma's closet and takes them, and that's what she wears. And so we were like just commenting on that, and then we started thinking about all of this. I ever since I learned about the history of pockets and the sexism there, I'm always telling people the story of that. And so I told them that story, and then we started talking about the connections with climate and the connections with how a lot of immigrant people and immigrant women are working in garment industries. And then we were like, we should have a whole campaign around this, because there's so many issues that we work on at Sojourners for Social Justice that relate to clothing, that relate to fashion, both in the history of gender justice to right now with climate change and the workers' rights. And so that's how we came to think of this campaign. So it was very organic. We were commenting on that. And yes, my coworker and her grandma's closet was a big inspiration for this. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining, for sharing your learnings, for sharing your actions, and for sharing your desire to learn more and take action.
Thanks for watching one of the 7 episodes of Clothed in Glory. And don't forget to subscribe to support SojoAction's work and see more content like this.